Our guest is Jamin Kusuania. He's a rebuilding advocacy manager at International Rescue Committee. Good morning, Jamin.
Good morning.
It's good to have you on the show. Welcome to Kenya's biggest conversation and the hot seat.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here, especially when you have this conversation on the International Women's Day and a key focus on women refugees and the elements of inclusion. As we commemorate the International Women's Day, we will acknowledge that we have many disparities that continue to arise, even after we have made large milestones towards gender equality.
Great. We are also supposed to have another guest in the studio with us, Samuel Olando. He's the Executive Director of Pamoja Trust. Unfortunately, he's been taken ill, but he was hoping to join us via Zoom. We'll see if we'll be able to connect with him. But tell us, Jamin, what is the International Rescue Committee?
The International Rescue Committee is a non-governmental organization that has been existing since 1933, dealing with persons who have been displaced by conflicts, with the floods, with the biggest focus on refugees, IDPs, and persons victims of human trafficking. In Kenya, we have been around since 1992. Our biggest focus has been dealing with refugees in both Kakuma and the Dadaab refugee camp, but also the focus in urban area where we certainly do livelihood programs and a rebuild program currently that we are conducting. We also support host communities because we realize that refugees exist within communities where we have Kenyans, and many times they face the same difficulties. And so our programming looks at both the refugees and the host communities in the areas where refugees are certainly resident. In Nairobi, we are having a livelihood program that is focused on both the Kenyans and refugees, called the Rebuild Program, but a deliberate focus on women so that we can be able to uplift their way of living, targeting both the skills acquisition, access to apprenticeship, access to certification, and also access to grants and capital for these particular refugees so that they can be able to be self-reliant.
There are very many organizations in country that handle refugees at one point,
Yes.
from one point to another. Talking about just international refugees, let's not even talk about internally displaced,
Yes.
right? Let's just talk about people who are coming into the country from across the borders.
Yes.
How do they get here, and how many agencies or institutions deal with them?
We have very many agencies that actually deal with refugees. And currently we have approximately 529,000 refugees in the country. About 40% of those in Kakuma, 44% in Dadaab, and about 16% living in urban areas. And so refugees will come into the country via different means. Majority of those that we have in the country, they just cross over the border. They have come from Somalia, where we have more than 200,000 refugees currently in Kenya. They have come from South Sudan, where we're also talking about almost 200,000. They have come from Ethiopia. We have refugees from Burundi. We have refugees from Uganda. We have refugees from Eritrea. And so a majority of these actually just cross the border when the situations in their country are untenable for their safety and for their own survival. And so Kenya as a country is a party to the International Convention on Refugee Protection. And so hosts refugee and has been hosting refugees since the 1980s, but specifically in a more formalized way since 1991, 1992, when we had the biggest refugee crisis, especially coming from Somalia with the host of Mohamed Said Barre. But then having a formalized legal document, what we call the Refugee Act, in the year 2006. But we are happy that now we are speaking about a new Refugee Act, the Refugee Act of 2021.
When you talk about the refugees who are in our camps, the word camp, like say for instance, we talk about Dadaab, it's not just one big camp. The other smaller camps that are associated with Dadaab.
Yes.
Now, the communities you mentioned, these are our neighbors. If you talk about Somalia, talk about Ethiopia, talk about Southern Sudan, these are our neighbors, Uganda.
True.
Do we have refugees who come from other parts of Africa in these refugee camps?
The majority, the bulk of the refugees that we have actually just come from within our neighbors. But then we have had refugees who have come from Turkey. We have refugees who have been in the country, who have come from Yemen. And the reason is that in the pursuit for safety, refugees have the leeway to choose where do they actually feel safe from. But secondly, is that there are people who would come into this particular country not to seek asylum, but when they arrive in the country, the situation in their home area is worse off. And so they are not able to go back to their home areas. Those persons can be able to seek asylum. And I'll give an example right now. We have Ukraine and what's happening, and you have heard that we have some Ukraine tourists who are around and they don't want to go back to their home area. So they have that particular opportunity under international law to seek asylum in this country because the situations from their place of origin is worse off, though they didn't come into the country in the very first place to actually seek asylum.
So what are we signatories to that enables us to be able to follow the dictates and the acts that have to relate to refugees? What international convention did we sign into?
Yes. I think the access to asylum is what we call in international law jus cogens. That it has
Who again?
Jus cogens. That it has taken
Please spell it.
JUSCOGENS, which simply means
Is that Latin?
Yes, it is.
Okay, carry on.
That they are practices that have taken over a long period of time that we have accepted them to be our way of life. And so in I think the Declaration on Human Rights of 1948 talks about the right to asylum and that persons shall have right to asylum. But then even then, in 1948, we didn't have proper mechanisms in terms of who is this who actually qualifies to access asylum. But in 1951, we have the International Convention on the UN Convention on Refugees, and we have the 1967 Optional Protocol of 1967. And so Kenya has been party to the convention and the protocol, but also the 1989 OAU Convention on Refugees that we are party to, that then allows us to be able to reciprocate what other countries will also be able to do in terms of receiving refugees. But also we have domesticated this in the Refugee Act of 2006, but then now with the Refugee Act of 2021, where we set the criteria in terms of who qualifies to be a refugee, what are the institutions that are going to manage refugees, what are the rights of refugees even as they come into this particular country.
Okay, so with the over 500,000 refugees in the country,
Yes.
and even as we're talking about gender equality as something that we are striving to, it would be interesting to see or to note the ways in which gender inequality plays out within the refugee status. And so could you give us pointers as to how that works? Because in the imagination, it would be that, look, these are folks who are looking for asylum. You wouldn't see some of these issues playing out, or that would be the assumption that you wouldn't necessarily see. But then have we seen these inequalities play out, and how do they play out within the refugee situation?
I think gender inequality in the wildest sense, as it affects, I think many times we have societies where we have one thing or the other that will affect one society and another. But then you realize that gender inequality affects us as a globe. The question would be how it manifests from one particular society then to another. The refugee space has been disadvantaged for a period of time. Because then, in terms of equality, we are looking at social, economic, political. Refugees have not been included, for instance, living in this country, some for the last 30 years, some born here. They've not been included in social or even economic aspects that they will be able to survive. Women specifically, people will run away from their home countries. They do not have skills. And so when they come into this particular country, if they do not have the option, for instance, of moving towards the tertiary level, then their skills, they actually shut off from accessing work and other opportunities that will come with it. Our institutions, over these particular years, we have not economically included refugees either in county services or either in national services. Social protection funds that we have in this particular country, they do not include refugees. So whether they are women social protection funds, then the women refugees have actually then been left out of this. And so even before and this many times happens, that people would look at gender equality as more of representation. And therefore, they'll be asking how many political leaders. But then the discussion needs never end there. Because we have millions of women who will never aspire even to vie for any particular seat, even if they were given the chance to. And so we need to ask ourselves that what is it that the majority of other women face that discriminate them from accessing their full potential, whether it is access to skills, whether it's access to credit and capital, whether it's access to governance. How do they participate in decision making in the counties and the national level? Refugees have been excluded from participating either at the governance level in the areas where they reside and even at the national level in terms of the access to services.
That brings an issue that's still running in my mind, which is the rights that one has when they become a refugee. But let me start from that other point.
Yes.
What is the process of identification and recognition of a person as a refugee?
Yes.
What do they need to go through? I mean, someone has crossed the border. Okay. So at what point do we, in our government records, say that so-and-so is a refugee in this country?
Thank you. The responsibility of managing refugees is the responsibility of government. And government, under the Ministry of Interior, has a department called the Department of Refugee Services. The Department of Refugee Services is given the mandate of managing refugees and providing documentations to refugees. So when someone walks into the country, they are supposed to notify their intention to seek asylum to the Commissioner of the Department of Refugee Services. Once then that has been notified, then they are given appointment for them to undergo a particular interview. And why? It's because for one to become a refugee, they need to qualify. Our international convention and even our national law spells out a refugee as a person who has run away from their country of origin because of reasons of either war, discrimination in terms of religion, discrimination in terms of race, in terms of political or even a social opinion. And so the interview process, what we call the refugee status determination, is to actually check that the reasons that you have run away from your home area are actually this, and that you are not running away from prosecution in your country, but you're actually running away from persecution from the country where you are running from. If persons qualify, then they will be recognized as refugees and they cease being asylum seekers. If they do not qualify, then they are denied that particular process and then they are required by law to go back to where they actually came from. The cornerstone of refugee protection is what we call the non-refoulement, that we cannot send someone back home when the situation that they have run away from is actually still there. And so it is based on this that the refugee status determination has actually to ascertain that these particular people ran away from their home area because of these particular issues.
And then, City, I just want to follow up on that. So the person who has crossed the border has the responsibility to seek the commissioner and apply for asylum.
Yes.
But this person is already so lost. I mean, they're entering a new country. Is there like a border point that says this is where you seek asylum from? What's the responsibility of the commissioner to make themselves accessible to this person?
Yeah, I think you point a good issue. One, majority of refugees who will come in this particular country will not even move through the designated entry points as we know them to be, because one, they do not know them. But even if they knew them and they were running en masse, then it will be list of their concerns, which is the legal border for entry and which one is not the legal border for entry. And so the law allows that they are to notify themselves to the government office that is nearest to them. And so from that government office, then they will be referred to the Department of Refugee Services. The Refugee Act of 2021 now asks the commissioner to ensure that at where we have designated entry points, at least we have officers from his office who are found in those particular areas. And where they are not, then the immigration officers then help in that particular referral to his office.
Okay, now that brings me now to that question.
Yes.
So once this person has been identified as a refugee and documented as a refugee, what rights do they have?
The refugee rights are similar to rights that Kenyan citizens enjoy, only to a small extent the political rights in terms of participation in vote. And why do I say so? That the Bill of Rights speaks about the rights of people. And when you look at the Bill of Rights, it's not speaking, and I think it's only Article 35 within that broad that will be speaking about the right of a citizen to access information and that. And so all these particular rights, which are actually human rights, they are rights that refugees are actually entitled to be able to achieve. Then, over the years, it's what about the right to work?
Mm-hmm.
What about the rights to services? And that indeed, our Refugee Act of 2021 now makes it plainly clear, because it wasn't that way, and therefore they operated like it was a gift or a token that was supposed to be given. The Refugee Act of 2021 speaks about their right to work, practice their own profession, because we have many refugees who come from their own countries. They were either doctors, some of them were even engineers, but then they end up living within the refugee camps without independent, without the ability to exploit their full potential. Where they qualify, then they can be able to practice those particular professions within the country. It speaks about their rights to be included even in the county integrated development plans, because yes, if they live within Nairobi, then they will need to also participate within the planning process of the city. It speaks about their rights to documentation, because then document becomes a key element for them to be able to access services at the national or even at the county level. We have had refugees not able, for instance, who want to operate border and even operate taxis, not able to access driving licenses, so they have to depend on handouts. We have them.
Is there a process
Yes.
within the realms of this of the refugee world where they can acquire some of these rights to actually participate in the normal lives of the people in the country in which they are refugees?
Yes, because the inclusion aspect, programming for refugees for a long period of time excluded refugees as a small entity away from the rest of the Kenyans. But then progressively, there is what we call the sharing of resources and inclusive of both refugees and even the host communities. And therefore, our act speaks about the rights to ensure that we have actual inclusion of refugees. We have refugees enabled to access work. We have refugees enabled to be included in development plans. We have refugees enabled to participate in affairs of their own governance, because then they exist within the community and the societies where we are.
So that also goes into that area that you had mentioned earlier, right to social protection.
Yes.
So when you're talking about the Inua Jamii funds, when you talk about free maternity, the refugees are also included by law. When you talk about LFCTA, the refugees are also in that list of the people to benefit from
Or
LFCTA.
is it an aspirational thought, something that they ought to be included in?
The law provides that they ought to be included. But then the process, the practice is that we have not reached that particular level where refugees have been included.
Why?
And so I think it's an element of a lot of lobbying from our end for inclusion. The Refugee Act of 2021 signed in November provides at least that particular leeway that we are now going to be moving towards more inclusion at county, more inclusion at national, more inclusion at on the social protection funds and those particular aspects. And this is the reason that the issues that will affect refugees, the issues that will affect refugee women, are similarly issues that will affect every woman. And so the only way then to move, and especially having had protracted refugee situation in this country, for instance, for the last 30 years, we have refugees who have been born here, they are 30 years old. Chances are that they may not even go back to their home area. They don't know even where actually they came from. And so it's only better if we are going to be able to include them within our systems in the country for them to be able to depend on themselves. Refugees being dependent on aid, and over the years, what we have seen is that aid has actually been decreasing as we're having an increase in the number of refugees in other particular countries. And therefore, the only proper way to do is empower refugees to be self-reliant, to be able to support themselves and their family, instead of relying on donor aid year in, year out, which also robs them of their dignity by the end of the day.
We said that we'll be joined by Samuel Olando, who's the Executive Director of the Pamoja Trust. He joins us now via video link. Samuel, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thank you very much for joining us, even though it's via video link. We want to take a break and then we come in. We will introduce you properly. You'll tell us about Pamoja Trust and the work that you're also doing in highlighting the plight of women, especially women refugees. Good job already being done by the International Rescue Committee, as Jamin has been telling us. Let's take this break. It's 29 minutes after 8 o'clock. This is Kenya's biggest conversation, The Situation Room. We are live on KTN Home, on SpiceFM, and we're also live on YouTube and Facebook. The conversation we're having this time is surrounding Women Day, and it's the plight of refugees. What do we need to know about women refugees, whether they're living in camps or they're living within communities? Good morning.
Spice.
Conversation continues with Jamin Kusuania, Rebuilding Advocacy Manager at International Rescue Committee, Samuel Olando, Executive Director of Pamoja Trust, and of course we are in the Situation Room, Eric Latif, CT Muga, Ndu Oko. So just before we took the break, we were introducing Samuel Olando to the conversation. We've been talking about the plight of women refugees who are in the country, and Jamin has told us, well, the rights that the refugees have, the challenges that the women refugees are facing, and that's a continuation of the conversation. Tell us about Pamoja Trust, though, Samuel.
Good morning, Latif. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join you. I had a bad cold, and I feared for you guys at the studio.
You did well to fear.
Exactly. So I want to join my colleague Jamin, whom we were collaborating with in the program around urban refugees. And as an organization, we focus quite a lot on Article 43, particularly right to basic, right to housing, right to health, right to water and sanitation, and right to social protection, a conversation that we did have with Jamin a few moments ago. And as we mark the International Women's Day, it's so important to situate this within the planning documents that we did allude to earlier, particularly when you speak about inclusion and integration of refugees. And the question that we begin asking ourselves is that after you recognize and give the refugees a status, then they have got the right to participate in elements that include and integrate them within the communities that they live in. And that brings us to the planning documents within the devolved system of governance. And as you can see, majority of the devolved functions actually oscillate around Article 43. Be it right to water, be it right to health up to level 4, be it right to basic education and child education, be it elements of perhaps social protection, and be it also elements of right to housing. So then what is the place of urban refugees, particularly women whom we are celebrating their day today, in being part and parcel of planning and government allocation of resources at that local level? So that's what as an organization we are doing, engaging with communities, but also engaging with the county government to ensure that the voice and space of urban refugees is created and they participate in co-creation of the communities.
Samuel, how many women refugees are you dealing with currently who are urban refugees?
I cannot say that often because we are speaking about integration, and integration become a part and parcel of the communities that we engage with. So that when we engage with the Kibra community, then from an integration perspective, the women refugees that are part and parcel of this community are integrated within the residents associations, they are integrated within community-based associations, they are integrated within market committees, so that then they are part and parcel of these management structures of the devolved system of governance within the community level.
Are you saying it's a deliberate move not to basically identify them and say, now these are refugees in terms of your programming?
In terms of programming internally, yes, to monitor and identify the indicators and the progress they are making, we do that. But in terms of debate, it may not be great to separate them because that will negate the conversation around inclusion and integration, because in inclusion and integration, we are arguing that they are part and parcel of the community. So then when we start setting them aside, then we will say, okay, fine, is there preferential treatment that they need because of the form of multiple discrimination that they may face? So then they come as part and parcel of the communities and, contribute to the imagining of the communities and the integration of communities and planning of the communities that they come from.
Right. So what we're looking at now is it's clear that there's a problem. There are issues here. Then when it comes to realizing their rights and then doing something about it. But it's interesting because you both said recognition of the lack is also an issue. Is there even a recognition of some of these rights then that these women in the refugee status would have? So from where I am, in order for you to do something, there needs to be a recognition of the problem in the first place as your basis, or establishing and saying, okay, first of all, folks, there's an abrogation of rights here. Whether they're refugees or not, there's a problem. Has there been adequate, whether it's from the groups who are working in community with them, the host nations, the nations that host them, is there adequate recognition then towards solution finding for them?
We have certainly recognized what challenges that refugees and more particularly refugee women actually face in this particular country. And they are in various forms. One is that in terms of access to labor market, that has been denied of them for a long period of time. And so this would be either because they lack skill, either because they don't have access to work permit and therefore they cannot be able to participate in the formal economy as we know it to be at the moment. Mm-hmm. The second aspect has been exclusion from access to both county and national services. So access, even accessing a business permit in Nairobi County for a refugee is not possible because they have moved them to electronic to be done online, mm-hmm. and therefore the refugee documentation for document has not been customized for that. The second bit has been in terms of access to credit and even financial inclusion. Refugees, for many years, they have not been able to even open a bank or even an M-Pesa account. And which ordinarily, if we deny them services where we will say that we will require a huge investment, this is just a platform for them to be financially included, them having an M-Pesa, then having a particular bank account. And that has been denied out of them. The other aspect is in terms of participation in governance and planning. Because if they do not participate in governance and planning, then you do not plan for them. And so, the earlier conversation, that the exclusion in terms of access to services has a huge contribution because they were excluded from the very beginning at the planning process, at the governance process. And therefore, their voices and participation has not been accorded a key platform within the governance structures that we have in this particular country.
Let me ask the question, where in the world do we have refugees enjoying some of these rights and privileges that you speak of?
I would say the biggest number of refugees across the globe, apart from a few countries in Africa, actually access these particular rights, especially some rights that for me and you would look basic. Why, for instance, would you deny a refugee to open an M-Pesa account where they will be putting their money and transacting? Where would you deny a refugee to have a bank account where they'll be depositing their money if they do business and that? When you look at the contribution that refugees could be able to offer to a particular country, then we will begin to ask the question, why the exclusion? A refugee today who would want to work and even pay taxes in this particular country, they're not able to do so. We have majority who work in the informal sector, but they do not pay taxes. Why? Because our system as it is, they can't be able to access a KRA PIN. And so, when we look at the skills that they come with in the country, is that refugees have come in this country not to work. They were not looking for green pastures. They were looking for survival. And therefore, their access to skills means that once they go back to their home area, when they go, is that they have skills that could go to build up their home country. And therefore, it lessens the disruptive aspect that we experience from countries where they originate from, if they have skills that they could go out and build their own country. And even them being able to support their children and their families within the country. Because if we do not, therefore, then do so, it will mean they have to be dependent. The day international help then declines, it means then the country has to bear the burden of taking care of refugees and feeding and sustaining
But
them.
you know, it's strange you should say this because Kakuma was founded in 1991 and Dadaab in 1992.
Yes.
But we've had refugees come into this country long before these camps were set up. And refugees, if my memory serves me right, served or rather enjoyed these very privileges you're saying they don't have. They worked. They just carried on their lives as normal. For instance, during the reign of Idi Amin in Uganda, okay, there were very many Ugandan citizens who were in Kenya. They were working. They were known to be Ugandans. They're not Kenyans, but they were working. Many of them later got assimilated, stayed in Kenya. The same happened with Rwanda. The same happened with Southern Sudan. The same happened with Somalia. Now, if this has happened before, what is this new thing that now suddenly seems to be taking us back from where we were before? Is it the large numbers who suddenly came in because the countries were even more unstable? What happened?
I think that's a good observation. And majority of us would admit that in the 70s and the 80s, even a majority of the teachers who taught within our schools, some of them came
Ugandan.
from Ugandan.
Very many.
And so when we began having, and we didn't have camps even then.
There were no camps.
So once we had a huge number of refugees coming into the country, I think the gains and the rights that they actually had were in a way, I would say, taken away from them. And so because of the big number that we were now having, then their rights were actually abrogated. And so, and you will know that even on those particular times, we didn't even have a refugee act that would enable them. The management of refugees happened from the office of the vice president. It was Home Affairs then.
It was.
And so they were then given documentation and assimilated and allowed to work and operate within every part of the country. With the 1991 and 1992, many refugees coming to the country, those particular rights then were again taken away from them. And therefore, we began from the very beginning.
Can I say something, Jamin?
Yes.
We commercialized refugees.
We commercialize refugees. It depends. It depends from what
Those
particular
camps
quarter.
were beneficial to various actors when they were camps. And when they had people staying in a concentrated area called a refugee camp.
I would not deny that particular element in terms of what would be the benefit of having a refugee camp. But when you look at the plight of the people, the refugees themselves, then, and I'll give an example. You have refugees born in the Dadaab refugee camp who have never left that particular camp. They have gone to primary school and to high school, no tertiary education. And so it becomes difficult for you to even be able to encourage refugees to access education in the camps where it is free, because they have seen persons who have gone until finished high school, but they have no hope. They have not been able to do anything on their own. They have depended on aid all the years long. And therefore, a time to change that particular way, that we broaden their rights in terms of their right to movement, their right to access work, their right to be able to access skills, including tertiary skills, their right for even involvement in the development of the country. And even as we pursue durable solutions toward refugees, actually three of them. And one is resettlement, where some of them, actually a very small fraction, actually resettled to Western countries. But then the second is actually voluntary repatriation and refugees going back to their home area. And this is dependent on how is the situation in their home country, because it has to be voluntary. And the third aspect is actually integration. And integration in the country where they actually sought refuge. And so within this particular pursuit towards durable solutions, countries need to be practical in terms of what is possible. What are we doing, for instance, into our element of integration, just to access services? What are we doing in terms of ensuring, then this is the international community, repatriation? How is the situation in Somalia? What is the efforts of government and the United Nations in restoring peace in those particular areas? Because if there is no peace in that particular area, then we continue to have a flooding of refugees coming to our home countries. What are the number of resettlement quotas, for instance, that will happen from the Western countries? And so all this discussion on durable solution need to be pursued by all countries. And our stake as a country is the element of integration for persons to be self-reliant and to be able to support themselves in the country and cease being a burden.
You know, when you have huge numbers of refugees coming to this country, I remember, it's in my living memory, it was from Somalia. Large numbers.
Yes.
And they were not just only, some even moved to Mombasa. But the problem when you have a war is you may be importing that war into your country. So the idea, yes, Eric has a point when he says containing refugees in one location, yes, has a commercial element to it, but it also has a security element to it. Because how do you know that all these people coming in are genuinely running away from a problem? They may not be running away, they may be just using the opportunity to infiltrate and come into your country. So when people are in a camp, you are able to determine who each individual is. But if they just sort of like come into the country and filter and get into normal life, do you really know who you will have let into your country?
I will tell you with the benefit of information that the contrary is true.
Please.
That persons who have been engaged in war, persons who have perpetrated war, one, they do not qualify for refugee protection. But then secondly, is that...
But how will you know?
Good. So the refugee status determination is a thorough process of identifying people and who they are. And so, but I admit that in sometimes, some of the people could then pass out in those particular aspects. But then when you look at it, concentrating people in a particular camp without giving them a right to be able to feed themselves and rely on themselves, then you make them vulnerable. Once people then remain vulnerable, as you said, then they are actually easy targets of insurgents and recruitment to go out and engage in war in their home countries. But then if people are actually engaged, they have right to participate, they have other things that will keep them busy than staying in the camp and not knowing what the future holds for them by the end of the day. And so, refugee camps, in my own admission, they should be there to offer humanitarian assistance. Because, you see, when people run into the country, not everybody knows where they go. They have nothing to offer humanitarian assistance.
So it should be a stopgap measure, short term to medium term.
True, but then transition that for them to be able to support themselves, and they see it being a burden to the country and also to the international community by enabling them to be able to participate in the affairs of the country. Economic inclusion and social inclusion, and even be able to pay taxes in the countries where they find themselves. All of us here would admit that refugees from Germany during the Nazi and the Hitler, majority of them being Jews, found their way to the US. We all know the contribution that the Jewish community has done in the United States of America.
Right.
And so we begin asking ourselves...
And other parts of Europe.
True. And so we begin asking the question that what is the potential that we are letting go of refugees? If anything else, Kenya is a country of 50 million people. The number of refugees is about 500,000. When you do that particular percentage, is like 0.01%. And so asking ourselves, what is the motivation of us excluding this category of people who have run away from their country because they have a need, who have run away from the country because they need to survive, and therefore excluding them, making their situation worse because in their home country, before disruption, they're actually working, feeding for their family, feeding for their children. But now their dignity is robbed of them because they have to develop on handout and they can't be able to provide for their countries.
Samuel, I want to throw this at you, Samuel, and I mean, you two have done a very good job of explaining to us the rights of a refugee and the rights that those refugees are currently being denied, various ways, either in planning, in implementation, in very many ways in enforcement of the law. Samuel, is there an opportunity here for someone to go to court on behalf of the refugees and say, look, we have people who are recognized as residents of this country who are being denied those rights that you said, Article 43 rights?
Yes, someone can go to court, but within the same breath, we will not sign the optional protocol to the International Convention on Economic and Social Rights that then gives us the teeth to be able to litigate on this more effectively. But that notwithstanding, by virtue of Article 2.5, we've domesticated the international instruments that Kenya as a nation has ratified, that they form part and parcel of our laws. So that's why when we speak about commercialization of refugees, but then the question we ask ourselves is, how do we treat Article 43? What is our investment in terms of progressive realization of this right? What is our investment in terms of policy directions that we are taking as a nation in terms of implementation of Article 43? So that when you come back and appraise whether there is positive movement in regard to Article 2.5 that domesticates international instruments, including the rights of refugees, and now implement that in relation to Article 43 on basic services for economic and agricultural rights. That notwithstanding, I think we do not need to fall in the trap of the narrative that the plight of refugees has been commercialized. And this is because if we don't have a legal framework similar to the Refugee Act of 2021, then we will in most occasions be pushing them to the informal economy. And informality has got a problem because it brings around a lot of exploitation, and there is element of radicalization that can also set in as highlighted by Jamin. That's why we need to make it part and parcel of the local mechanisms that promote development, be it in the context of planning documents, resource allocation, and being part and parcel of the, even including Mbakumis, and that's in association of the communities that they come from, so that then they self-appraise and they self-evaluate themselves and they screen themselves at that level. And
but Samuel, there clearly seems to be a clear understanding of the responsibility of duty bearers, but also a neglect of those duties. How do we make these work? How do we get action on all these things? We know we have all the laws, we have understanding of these laws, but it's just not happening. And yet, there's a young girl, there's a young boy who is a refugee in this country who's not enjoying the benefits of these rights.
So action is within the invited spaces. And these invited spaces exist in numerous platforms, and we did indicate initially the planning documents as one of the platforms upon which inclusion and integration can be anchored upon. And we did say that when we develop planning documents, there are spaces of making proposals, there are spaces of holding government accountable in terms of reviewing the progress that is made. That's at the domestic level. You can also go to court, as you did put it early, as a recourse. At the regional level, there are various regional mechanisms that as non-governmental organizations and as communities you can engage with in terms of doing parallel reports or shadow reports and engaging the various committees. Like you can engage the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, you can engage the Committee on Civil Political Rights, who will in turn engage government through giving concluding observations on various policy measures that the state needs to take in order to ensure that there's progressive realization of these rights.
Jamin, what would be the preferred mode for settling this? You've talked about resettlement, you've talked about repatriation, and you've also talked about integration. Vis-a-vis the challenges which you see already, it would seem as though if you reintegrated them into society, all you're doing is taking the problems that would be experienced in the refugee situation and inputting them into society. So what would be the preferred way of going about this?
Thank you for that. To first borrow from what Sam had said is that it's true. We are grateful. We have been pushing for policy changes in the country for quite a period of time. And we are happy that we managed to have the Refugee Act in November of last year, after many years of pursuit, that now begins to give rights to refugees to be able to access these particular services. And so now working towards implementation of that particular act to look at the realization of these particular rights of refugees. In terms of durable solutions, and whether we would then be importing from the refugee camps to the rest of the society, is that the model of integration has to put in place aspects of inclusion so that then the refugees are not a burden. Removing refugees from the camp, bringing them to Nairobi or any other particular area without looking at their financial inclusion, their social and their right to work, then it does not help them. Actually, I would not even advise us to move toward that particular route because they become more vulnerable, they become more exposed within the country if then we do not have these aspects in place. And that's why in the process of integration, we need to ensure that we offer them inclusion in these particular services at the county, at the national level, so that we can be able to enable them to participate, just like the rest of us, in this particular economy, feed their to be able to feed their countries. In terms of repatriation, is that nations need to work with each other so that we do not have war in Tigray, in Ethiopia, because when we have war in Ethiopia, we'll have an influx of refugees in the country. If we do not have stability in Somalia, if the elections in Somalia are not then done well, then we have an influx of refugees into the country. And so countries have a responsibility, either within themselves in terms of integration or even through collaboration with other particular countries, for us to be able to ensure that we have durable solutions for the refugee menace that we have had in this particular area.
Jamin, we thank you very much for joining us in the studio. Jamin Kusuania is the Rebuilding Advocacy Manager at the International Rescue Committee. It's an organization that has been in the country since 1992, like you said. And Samuel Olando, who joined us via video link, is the Executive Director of Pamoja Trust. We are commemorating International Women's Day today, and this particular hour we're focusing on the plight of refugee women who are in this country. We've understood them, we've understood what they're going through, we've heard how many are in the country in various parts, in various camps or in urban areas within the community. They need to be integrated. We've been live on KTN Home. The conversation continues on SpiceFM in the next hour, and you can switch on to SpiceFM around the country or SpiceFM KE, YouTube and Facebook,